Now, when we come to this concept of what is our mission, typically most people will return to a particular passage of Scripture that you are probably familiar with, and that would be Matthew chapter 28. You're very familiar with this passage. This is not going to be our chief text today. We're actually going to be in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. If you want to get there, that's where we'll be for most of our time. But when we think about what are we supposed to be doing as a church, as a people, there's got to be more than just trying to get a group of people gathered on a Sunday morning. There's got to be more to what God's called us to do than just gather each week, singing the great songs that we enjoy, encouraging one another. There's got to be something more. And so we must go to the Scriptures to discover what that might be. And most of the time, we will go to a passage like this. These are Jesus' last words, where Jesus says, coming to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, you're familiar with this part, aren't you? Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. That's where we normally put all of our attention as a church. We want to make sure that people come to know Christ, that we share the gospel with them, they hear that, they respond to that, they are baptized. But sometimes we forget what the rest of the things that Jesus said. He said, in addition to that, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. Now that's where it becomes maybe a little less clear for us, because we try to figure out what is it that everything that Jesus commanded them, and does that have any inclination or does that extend to anything beyond just what Jesus said, but what is found in His Word? And I'm going to suggest to you that it does, and that sometimes it's going to be difficult for us to try to figure out exactly what we're supposed to be doing as a congregation, especially as the days change and we live in stranger and stranger times. The encouragement, though, is at the end of this where he says, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. So we have the encouragement that no matter what, as we try to figure out what it is that we're supposed to be doing, both as an individual and collectively as a people, that we have this confidence that Christ is with us to help us figure that out. Now, one of the challenges is that the church has always got a little confused on this sometimes. Sometimes the church moves to just being spiritual, about spiritual things, and just concentrates on the gospel and retreats from the world, trying to keep the gospel pure and holy. At other times, the church decides that's not the official calling, it's not the only thing that we're supposed to be doing, and the church goes out into the community and begins to do works of good things and do opportunities of service in all the areas, and yet somehow strays from the original intent of the gospel. And so we have to look at the Scriptures, and the Scriptures remind us of the challenge of that. In fact, there's some other passages in the Scripture that seem to indicate that God is interested in what we do even beyond the spiritual things. Matthew 25 talks about that there are people as believers that we're supposed to visit the sick, we're supposed to visit the one in prison, we're supposed to help the one who is in need, and somehow if we don't do that, apparently from Matthew 25 at least, when you look at that your salvation is in question if you don't do those things. Deuteronomy talks about the way that you're supposed to appoint judges to make sure that there's peace among men and men, and Isaiah talks about that if you don't do those things, then you are as guilty as the rest. So there's a lot of work right now that's being written out there talking about what is the mission of the church. What should the church be doing? And so this week I've spent a lot of time reading and thinking, and I've tried to come up with what I think that our calling is as a people, as a congregation, and try to explain my understanding of that to you. Now, this message is going to be a little bit different than what you're used to. It's a little more philosophical. Last week was pretty simple, talking about the gospel, and some of you got bored last week with the gospel, and so I've tried to make it a little more difficult this week for those of you who like difficult things. And as I've looked at all those things, I think that our calling is more than just a spiritual one. So the question I want to raise is our mission only a spiritual one? Are we only supposed to deal with spiritual issues, or are we supposed to be involved in things that are beyond just spiritual? And then the final question, is our mission a Sunday morning only mission? Is our calling just to see how many people we can get into the room on Sunday morning, or is it something more? And as I've explored that, I think that, and by the way, if you have some comments or questions, here's my email address, franks@fbcbranson. If you'd like to tell me where I'm wrong, you can feel free to email me. If you can tell me where I'm right, you can email me as well. And so we can have a little dialogue, a little discussion. In fact, we may put up a discussion board if there's enough interest in that, but you can write me on those kind of things, tell me where I'm right and wrong. But I've come to the conclusion that our main focus as a congregation ought to be reconciliation. As I've studied the Scriptures and I've heard from all kinds of different people, read different things, I think that sometimes we as a people forget that our calling is reconciliation. And where do I find that? Well, it's found in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Notice the passage. It says this. All this is from God. Now, you have to read the things before that to understand what all this is. And so I am picking up in the middle. And so when you do that, there's the possibility of proof texting and missing the context. And so sometime you need to read what he's saying before that, because he's really talking about the need to communicate the gospel. But here's what he says. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ. All right, we talked about that pretty extensively last week. That is the gospel, the story of Christ reconciling us back to God through his own personal coming to the earth, living a perfect life, dying, and then being raised again. But notice the rest of that passage. Not only are we reconciled through Christ, but he gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So whatever reconciliation is, he's given us that ministry. That word ministry there is the same word that we get the word deacon from, diakonos. And that word diakonos really means servant or service. And so we have been given the service, the work, the responsibility of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. Notice he's reconciling, what is he reconciling? The world to himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against him, and he has committed to us the message, again, to us, the message, the word of reconciliation. And so you go on to read, we are therefore, if that's true, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors. As though God were making his appeal through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. I don't know if you noticed, but that word reconciled appears how many times? Anybody noticing? Yeah, more than one. Thank you for noticing. It was more than one time is that appeal in reconciled to God. So we have to ask ourselves, what is this concept of reconciliation and why is it important? Well, we discover this word is a Greek word that was used in the secular Greek, and I've taken the secular Greek definition from this so that we might have a better understanding of what Paul's trying to communicate. When you look at this word reconciliation, this word in that language meant the restoration of the original understanding, and I put relationship in there to have you think in those terms. The restoration of the original understanding between people after hostility or dispute. That's what reconciliation is, the restoration of the original understanding or the original relationship between people after hostility or dispute. So I'm going to suggest to you that we as the people of God have a mission to go into the world and bring restoration, fixing things that are broken between people after hostility or dispute. I don't know if you ever had a hostility or dispute, but there's kind of a couple of ways to think of that. Last Saturday, I had a surprise party for my wife. The ladies of the church jumped in and helped me on that. And so I kind of, didn't tell her all the truth about where she was going and what was happening. And so I gave her 30 minutes to get ready. Now, looking back in retrospect, 30 minutes was not enough time. Now, I think my wife is beautiful and needs no time to get ready, but apparently she doesn't think she's pretty because she needs more than 30 minutes to get ready. And so I said, hey, you need to get ready. We're going to have a picture taken. Had the boys all dressed up. We were all shining, looking good. That's pretty easy for us. We were there standing and said, hey, you got to catch up to us, and you have 30 minutes to do it. And she was intimidated by that ability. And for some reason, she said some things to me that I'm not going to repeat and slammed the door, and some other kind of things happened about all of that. And so we got in the car to sneak her to this lunch that was supposed to be in her honor. And I will tell you that we were no longer hostility among us, but things weren't right at that point. You know what I'm saying? Guys, I'm saying that you can get in trouble, and she's no longer mad at you, but the room is pretty cool, right? There's no open hostility. There's no hitting anybody at this point anymore. No one's yelling at anyone, but there's this ultimate kind of silent treatment. Anybody involved in that this morning on the way from parking lot here, and you're kind of in that? Okay, several of you are confession, and so we'll have some prayer partners at the end of the service. You can pray with them, see if they can bring reconciliation to your marriage. But you know the difference between the ending of hostility and good times, peacetime, right? There's more than just peace when hostility breaks out. There is the calm silence where everybody's angry at everybody. But then later on, after I had another party for her at the end of the week, finally I got a hug saying I love you at the end of all this after, from one Saturday to the next Saturday. It was like 7 days before things warmed up in the world. And then we've got this great relationship now. See, there's a difference in now and the difference in the ending of hostility. And the calling is not for us just to have the ending of hostility, but to have that restoration of relationship, like the way things were with God, the way things were with other people before the original understanding broke down. See, that's our calling that we have been given. Now, that calling is primarily in this relationship that's been given to us, this ministry, this work has been given to us, is primarily between man and God. Now, you know how this all works, right? I mean, we talked about this last week, that because of man's sin, there has been a break or a separation in that relationship. And because of that, because of our sin, because of our choice to be rebellious against God, now there is a wall between us, and there's no way to get through that wall. You can't be good enough. You can't be smart enough. You can't give enough money. You can't do any of those kind of things. There's only one way that breaks that wall down, and that is through Christ. And so Christ is the one who reconciles us toward God. That's who breaks that wall down. But we also have been given the ministry. See, the first part, all this is from God who reconciled us to himself through Christ. That's Christ's work, not our work. But he gave us the ministry of reconciliation. So once we come to know Christ, represented by the little white man there, we are called then to tell other people about this great reconciliation that they can find through God. And that is our primary purpose as a people, is to share that message, that gospel with others, so that they might have the benefit of being reconciled to God. But you know what? That's not the only area that we as believers are called to reconcile. Because now that we live in a broken world, and I'm a messed up person and you're a messed up person, there's going to be an opportunity for two messed up people to have a barrier between them and have a disagreement. And we as believers are also called to help reconcile man to man. So it's not just that we present the gospel and be spiritual and leave everything else alone. We're also to be involved in the reconciling of man to man, husband to wife, father to son, all those things we're a part of. But do you know what? We are not the only ones in that business. There are others that are in that business. For one, the police are in that business, right? Have you ever had to call the police because you couldn't solve an issue? Now, fortunately, my wife did not call the police on me after that. I think if she'd have gotten a female police officer, I think I'd have been in real trouble on that. And she would have probably had somebody on her side. But she probably knew it was probably going to be a male officer, and she would probably lose that battle. But the police are oftentimes involved. In fact, we have television shows that we watch about police going in, trying to resolve, or at least try to bring reconciliation. We also have counselors who may or may not believe the gospel, who are out there, psychologists, psychiatrists, who are trying to help people put things back together. So we've got a part in that as the church. Joey does a lot of counseling, and we've got other people at pastoral counseling. Jeff does a lot of that, where we try to help people mend those relationships. But we're not the only ones in that ball game. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be in that ball game, but we're not the only ones in that ball game. Other relationships, sometimes men and men, groups of men, groups of people, and groups of other people have challenges, and they have a break in the relationship, and we as the people of God are also supposed to be involved in those kind of things, because we have been given the work, the service, the ministry of reconciliation. But do you know what? When it comes to this kind of reconciliation, we are not the only ones involved here either. There are people out there who are attorneys that when someone gets sued in a class action lawsuit or some other kind of a disagreement, we're not supposed to necessarily be there and giving our advice, but God has granted attorneys to be there, and then sometimes he's also given governments to help people. And there's scriptures all about that. I don't have time to look at the scriptures that talk about how the governments are supposed to interplay between those things, but you and I are still supposed to be involved somehow as the people of God, men to men. But then there's another kind of reconciliation that needs to happen, and that is between groups of people. I'm going to use men, but groups of people and God. See, there are lots and lots of people in our world today who have no access to the gospel. You probably drove past dozens of churches on your way to here today, and for whatever reason you've selected to be here, but you didn't have to drive as far to hear the message of the gospel, because I believe the vast majority of our churches are preaching the gospel. Yet there are people who you can drive for literally hours and hours and not see an evangelical church. I was talking to Vince Blueball, director of communications at the Missouri Baptist Convention, helped us plant Rockaway Bridge of Faith Church. He was talking to me that in Canada there is one particular highway that you can drive 20 hours on that major interstate highway across Canada, and in those 20 hours you will not see a single evangelical church on that highway. Now, how long can you drive in Branson without seeing a church on a highway? Not counting the traffic and being stuck on 76, that might extend the time. But how long would it take you to get? Not very long at all. But here's a place, Canada, a relatively developed country, that you can drive 20 hours on a major highway and never find an evangelical church. You can go to other parts in the world that you can drive days, walk days, in places that they don't have any access to the gospel, and there are groups of people who are isolated from the gospel, and you and I, as the people of God, are called to do that, and there is no other group of people called to do that. Do you realize that? There's other people to help man-to-man relationship reconciliation. There's other people that are there to help men-to-men, but there's only one group of people who are called to bring the message of reconciliation between man and God and men and God, and that's us. And that doesn't mean that we don't do these other things, but that means it's our primary. So to answer the question really quickly, is our mission only a spiritual one? The answer is no. We have an obligation to be a part of the world bringing reconciliation wherever we can between man and man, men and men. But that's not the only thing that we're supposed to do. Is our mission primarily a spiritual one? Yes. Because the true heart of reconciliation is always going to be the fact that we have been reconciled, that man has been reconciled to God through the work of Christ. And so whatever area, whatever sphere we go into to make it better, that must be the root, that must be the core of all of that. Now, does that mean that our mission is only a Sunday morning mission? No. What we do is only a part of what our calling is. It's a very important part, and our gathering together is important, and we're going to do everything we can to impact people and reach people and get people to come on Sunday morning, and we're going to do all kinds of things, but that is not our only mission on Sunday morning, and in fact, it's not really even our primary mission. Our primary mission is loving people to Christ, living the journey together, sharing the gospel, that this message of reconciliation between man and God is available, because we live in a time today where people don't think they have done enough bad, or some don't think that they have broken that relationship, and we must go and remind them that they have broken that relationship with God. And sometimes saying you're sorry just is not enough. It can't fix anything. And God knew that our sorry would not be enough, and so he sent his own son to pay for the sacrifice so that we could have that relationship, and we are called to take that message into the world, and we're the only ones who have that message. We're the only ones that can take that message. And so that must be our primary purpose, and for the most part, that message has to happen outside of this room, because for the most part, people who need that message will not show up in church. So what we have got to do is to focus on these things coming together to gather so that we might go out. So our ministry, our purpose, our mission, if you will, is the message of reconciliation, which is what? The restoration of the original relationship between people after hostility or dispute. That can happen in our jobs, but person to person, man to man, men to men, but primarily that ought to be between us and people who do not know the gospel. But let me make sure that you don't misunderstand me, because I get misunderstood occasionally. My wife misunderstood my intention, so apparently that happens quite a bit, and so let me make sure that you understand what I'm not meaning, what we do not want. We do not want Christians to be indifferent toward the suffering around them and around the world. You know what? It's pretty easy to do that today. We live such isolated areas and isolated lives that we can forget the great need that is not only in our own country, not only in Stone and Taney counties, but literally around the world. And we as believers must not be indifferent to that. And it's not just enough to know about that and do nothing. Part of our calling is reconciliation, and a person can't be reconciled to God unless their suffering is alleviated, at least to some level. Number two, we do not want Christians to think that evangelism is the only thing that really counts. We don't want Christians to think that evangelism is the only thing in life that really counts. While it is a primary thing, it's not the only thing. And so we've got to do those things. Number three, we don't want Christians who risk their lives and sacrifice for the poor to think that their work is suspect unless it results in conversions. Because relieving human suffering is important. It is valuable, and there is something spiritual about that, because every person has the image of God within them. So we don't always need to look at that and say, well, it doesn't count unless somebody gets, quote, saved, because it does count. It is important. It is valuable. And we don't want Christians to stop dreaming of creative, courageous ways to love their neighbors and impact cities. I got to tell you this quick, at least this little stat. Ben Pilgreen in our Epic Church in San Francisco, he emailed me or texted me this past week, and he said they've just moved into some space that they've leased, and so they've got their own space. So now we don't have to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and put chairs up at the hotel. And their first Sunday in that new building, they had 212 people in worship service. And they've only been going since last February, and they've been normally running about 100, and they doubled. They had 40 new people show up who had never been to the church, before. And this past week, a young lady who works in the front office of the San Francisco Giants baseball team gave her life to Christ. Another person who would help them get this building doesn't like God, hates God, doesn't like Christians, not involved in anything, showed up to church and said, you know what, I think I'm going to come back next week. So God is doing amazing, incredible things in San Francisco, and we must be creative and courageous to love our neighbors in impact cities, and that's what Epic has done. So that's what we've got to do. Here's what we also want you to know, though. I want you to misunderstand. We do want to make sure that the gospel is of first importance to the church. So as we do all these other things, the gospel must remain of first importance to the church. We want the clear and unique task of the church, which is making disciples of Jesus Christ, the glory of the Father, put front and center and not lost in a flurry of activities. You know what? We got a lot of activities that happen at this church. We have a flurry of activities. We have a super flurry of activities in this church. But as we have a super flurry of activities, we must make sure that the unique message of disciple making is clear, and that is our task. That is our mission. But that doesn't mean that we just preach the gospel. It means we preach the gospel and we do all these other things as we do that. Number 3, and finally, the church must remember that there is something worse than death. And there's something better than human flourishing. And as we try to figure out how to make all that happen, by the way, that came in a book this week, which just happened to be mailed this week to my office, and the book was called What is the Mission of the Church? And so I was excited about that, except it's just a sample chapter, so I ran out of sermon material right there. That's all I have from that. So hopefully I'll get the book when it finally comes out. But those are some points that they make to remind us that these are things that are critical and important, because there is something worse than death. And there's something better than just human flourishing. What does that all mean for us? It means that our primary purpose is to share the gospel, that people might hear of reconciliation, that things can be better than they've ever been with God. In addition to that, we are called as a people to go and proclaim that message into places that are difficult, that are expensive to get to, that are hard to get to, because the message is not there. We've also been called, though, to share that message individually with people. And so individually, I've got to ask you, if you were to describe your relationship with God, is this what it would look like? Are you separated from God because of what you've done and because of who you are? Has there ever come a point in your life where you've asked for reconciliation between you and God? Because the truth is, when you sin, God has a barrier between you and Him, and there's no way to get across that. You can't be good enough. You can't be nice enough. You can't be sweet enough. You have a barrier between you and God, and there's only one person that can get you from one side to the other. The primary purpose of God's coming through Christ was that we might be reconciled to Him, and then have that message and bring that message to all of the world. But has that message come to you yet? Have you come to the point where you've received that? If not, today is the day to do that. And here's what all that has to happen. You have to admit that your need is of God, that you have broken a relationship, and that you are on the other side, and there's nothing that you can do to get back, and you recognize that Christ is that way. And you believe in Him so much that you don't just believe it in your mind, you don't just believe it in your heart, but you believe it in all of the core of your being. And you ask Him to forgive you of your sin, and to forgive you of that, and to make you right, and to reconcile you to Him through the relationship, through the blood of Christ. And if you ask for that, He will do that, and you will no longer be separated. And when you do that, you join this great part of the calling of the church to proclaim the gospel, for that is our mission. And next week we'll talk about what it means for us individually and how that plays out in the rest of our lives. I want to ask you to bow your heads and close your eyes this morning. I'm pretty excited today that if everything is going like it's supposed to go, we're going to see a demonstration of that here in just a moment with a baptism, if everything works the way that it's planned, and then we'll start off second service with a baptism as well. But the question that I've got to ask you right now, understanding that in the mission of the church, that we're to bring reconciliation to the world, have you had that reconciliation happen in your own heart? Have you come to that point in your life where you have admitted that you need this and there's a broken relationship? If you've never done that, today can be your day.